After the Marines had taken Seoul, the 8th Army of the United Nations forces had driven through the capital, moving rapidly northward along the Korean coast. To meet them, Chinese communist armies had marched 1,800 miles northward since mid-August. The Chinese strategist at first concentrated against the 8th Army positioned in the northwestern hills, but when the Marines landed, they hurriedly switched much of the power to meet and overwhelm them in the Chozin Reservoir. The Chinese drove between the Marines and the 8th Army and maneuvered into a position from which they could attack each force at will. So, podcast number 53, Colder Than Hell, is about the Chozin Reservoir. And there's another one, I forget the number, but we've done 2 podcasts about the Chozin Reservoir. Listen to those. I'm going to touch on it here as well. From the hills on every side of the perimeter, Chinese fire was heavy during the day. The enemy blew a tunnel and a bridge on the railroad below Kotori position, cutting the line to Hamhung and the Marine base on the sea. For 2 days, Puller called in heavy airstrikes upon concentrations of Chinese in the surrounding hills. Things were even worse in the 2 positions to the north of Puller. At least 6 Chinese divisions had been identified in the area where Murray and Litzenberg fought. On November 26th, these 2 posts lost 95 dead and 543 wounded in night-long attacks. Hagaru was preparing to fight for its life. An offensive launched by the 5th Marines was called off after the day's grim news from the west. The 8th Army had collapsed. One wing of it was torn to pieces, and the Chinese were slashing deep into the lines. Marines must now defend themselves against an enemy free to approach from any direction through the frozen mountains. The night of November 27th tested the men at Udamni when the 3 Chinese divisions fell upon 2 Marine regiments. The enemy cut the road to Hagaru and sent their assault battalions in quilted uniforms and sneakers into the Marine lines with disregard for casualties. The first waves were driven off with great losses, but the others were thrown in through the night and the next. To the dismay of the Chinese commanders, not even the envelopment of Marine command posts slowed the tempo of fighting, and the Americans staged vicious counterattacks even when many platoons had been reduced to the size of squads. There were not enough tent for Marine wounded, and the less seriously hurt were piled outside close together for warmth, covered with straw, as doctors worked over the more than 500 casualties. It now became clear that the 3 Marine positions in the Chozin area were surrounded. Puller's reaction to the dread news was given to newspaper men who flew into Kotori. Here's what Puller said. "We've been looking for the enemy for several days now. We finally found them. We're surrounded. That simplifies our problem of getting to these people and killing them." Yeah. There's no wonder why this guy's a legend. Puller prepared to open the road to Hagaru with Task Force Drysdale, a British commando unit of Royal Marines under Lieutenant Douglas Drysdale, accompanied by Captain Carl Sitter's company of Ridges Battalion, and a company from the 31st Army Regiment which had come in. The road had been blocked in several places, 2 bridges were out, and the Chinese swarmed on heights overlooking the route. The party met bitter opposition and within a few minutes had 14 casualties. In 3 hours and a half, they moved only 2 miles with 8 more to go. Puller sent tanks as support, and men came down from the hills to walk with them. They fought through roadblocks and around a blown bridge, but at dusk, in narrow defile, met an ambush and took serious casualties. By radio, Puller, Oliver Smith, and Drysdale agreed that the unit must push on to Hagaru whatever the cost. The Royal Marines finally reached Hagaru perimeter at 1:30 a.m. with 90 of its 255 men casualties. Sitter had 63. Only 70 of the 210 Army men made it. A truck column sent behind this ill-fated party was virtually destroyed after a long fight and parley with the Chinese, who captured all the trucks and most of the men. The survivors of this party were crucial to the defense of Hagaru. Their added firepower helped turn back another massive Chinese attack. The companies of Sitter and Joe Fisher killed the enemy in droves, and by the next dawn, their lines, though bent, had held. On the night of December 7th, the bulk of the division was in Puller's perimeter after the 38-hour battle from Hagaru. The cost, 103 dead, 506 wounded, 7 missing. But now the force of 10,000 and its 1,000 vehicles was at Coterie. The perimeter could hardly contain them all. After supper, the colonel disappeared. Only Sergeant Jones, and I haven't mentioned much about Sergeant Jones. He's Puller's right-hand man through all kinds of crazy stuff. And only Sergeant Jones knew where he was. The old man would sneak off with Bodie and go up into the lines, climbing right up into those damn straight-up hills, all the ice and rock going from hole to hole for half the night. He would go to every man he could find in a foxhole and say, "How you doing, old man? What's your field of fire? Who's on your flank? You getting enough chow?" On the way back, he would check the warming tents to see if there had been casualties and how the men were doing. Early on December 8th, the Marines began clearing the ridges on either side of the road south, but the going was slow and the trucks bearing the bridge sections made little progress. A funeral for 117 Marines in a common grave brought the day to an end in the perimeter. It was a scene that lived in Puller's memory, the burial of frozen bodies by a tank battalion which crushed them under frozen ground. A Marine photographer took movies of the burial. Puller said, "How I wish our people could have seen the sight, to see just what happened to us in Korea." He later heard that Army censorship in Washington kept the film from the public.